Lords of the Fallen was released in 2023 for the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Series X and S, and the PC. It is, in my opinion, one of the worst technically performing games I have played since I started reviewing video games. Even after nearly a year of patches and updates, it runs so poorly on Xbox Series X that I can't recommend you play it on console. Although I had mixed opinions on some of the design choices, the combat, and the narrative, it was the technical performance that made me want to ward anyone off from playing this game on console. Even though it is currently available on Xbox through Game Pass, it's still not worth your time playing.
After eons of tyranny, the demon god Adir was finally overthrown by humanity. Though fear of his terrible power endured. And so was formed the Hallowed Sentinels, our duty being to stand vigil for signs of his return.
Alright, with that introduction to Lords of the Fallen, obviously I'm going to start this review off with talking about the performance of the game on console. I played it on the Xbox Series X, allegedly the most powerful console available on the market, and although I didn't personally play the game on PlayStation 5, I can't imagine it being any better on that console either. Let's ease into this review by talking about crashes. Thankfully, I didn't have any. I was never booted to the home screen or kicked from a multiplayer session. For bugs, I did have a lot. Character models and enemies would clip into or become stuck on objects quite frequently. There was a running problem where my character would get boxed in during multiple combat encounters throughout the game. I would be blocked and gang up on by enemies, or even a single enemy whenever there was an object in the way or a small alcove in a hallway. This wasn't a few times, mind you. This happened enough times that it stands out in my memory as much as the frame rate drops. So let's talk about the main technical problem. Lords of the Fallen runs terribly on console. I'm not saying this like, oh, it's 30 FPS and it's unplayable. I'm talking about massive, prolonged frame rate drops on performance mode that could last minutes at a time. And not just when first entering an area, but often entire levels. You have two graphic modes for Lords of the Fallen. You have Performance mode, which tries to get 60 FPS, and then the Quality mode that aims for 30 FPS but enhanced graphics. Right off the bat, Quality mode is useless. You might as well try to make a PowerPoint presentation of Lords of the Fallen and try to play it that way than play in Quality mode, leaving you with only Performance mode. This one starts as hit and miss. Sure, it's steady at times, particularly in the early game when you're in the normal world of the living, but as the game progresses, it does get worse. Loading into a map, frame rate crashes. You try to run through a level, the frame rate tanks. Enter the Umbral world, which we'll talk about more in a second, the frame rate becomes incredibly unstable. There are multiple maps that have so much going on in it that the frame rate just can't keep up. I'm currently playing clips of it during this technical portion of the review, and you can see for yourself. There is a swamp section that is hit and miss for stable FPS, with things being relatively alright when you're in the world of the living, but if you switch to the Umbral, or the world of the dead, it becomes terrible. But it's when you reach Lor Calroth area, it's a large town that's on fire and filled with enemies, that the game becomes unplayable. Look at these clips and tell me you can play through this gauntlet of overpowered enemies, traps, pitfalls, jumping parts, puzzles, while the game chugs along at less than 10 frames per second. It's not that I'm being subjective when I say it's unplayable. This is an objective observation. You need to be able to at least respond to things happening to play this game, and the technical state of Lords of the Fallen on console doesn't allow you to do it in large portions of the game. The most basic, fundamental part of a game, the ability to reasonably play it, is absent for large chunks of Lords of the Fallen. And it isn't just in certain areas. The main hub area of the game, which is a small enclosed space with only a few NPCs, it becomes a mess, oftentimes completely freezing, not just as you load in, but as you travel through that small area. When you do load in, your character enters the room naked, and then your clothing and armor loads in afterwards. Speaking of the load times, Fast travel takes sometimes up to a minute, maybe even 2, to load into an area, but so does resting at a vestige, which is this game's version of a bonfire. You remember you play Dark Souls or Elden Ring, you touch a bonfire and the world just seamlessly resets in a moment? Lords of the Fallen doesn't do that. It can take a minute or 2 to refresh the world around you. This makes grinding for materials or XP tedious. Alright, so why is this happening? Why is the frame rate shit and the game not running right? Well, let's start with the engine. Unreal Engine 5 is a powerhouse. It's a graphically demanding beast that can render realistic environments, loads of objects on screen at once, and details that will burn even the best PC to ashes. The Xbox Series X and the PlayStation 5 aren't exactly new at the time of writing this review. And even when they were first released, they weren't on par with new PCs meant for gaming. That means when you have a game that uses Unreal Engine 5, the PC port is going to have a lot of graphical options, and then you're going to downgrade that game from there for the Xbox and the PlayStation. So when you're developing it, all those objects you wanted to put in there, maybe cut them down a lot. If you have lots of enemies, no. Massive detailed environments, forget about it. In the case of Lords of the Fallen, the developers obviously either didn't care about the console release, and that was either deliberate or inexperience. There's just too many enemies on screen at once, there's too many objects to render, and too much details in the environment for the consoles to keep up the frame rate. There are 2 worlds in Lords of the Fallen, the Axiom and the Umbral. The Axiom is like the normal world. It's filled with light and dark, and there's normal enemies and demons and things like that. It's what you would expect from a Dark Souls-like world. There's buildings on fire, there's floors and walls covered in blood, expansive environments that range from mountaintops, forests, swamps, to a burning city filled with monsters. So that's like your base. The Axiom runs reasonably well. Although there are a lot of slowdowns in the swamps and town sections of the game, as it renders the trees and the water and the fire, but it seems like the Axiom was the base of what they went for FPS. But then you switch to the Umbral, which is a large portion of this game, that the FPS takes its biggest hit. The Umbral is like the world that exists beneath the Axiom. It's a world of death. Similar to the Axiom, the layout is nearly always the same, but with additional details. So for example, the water disappears from the Axiom to the Umbral, and it reveals new paths. The bodies of giant undead beings can be seen in the distance or climbed onto to reach new areas. And there's this haze over everything, like a mist that obscures things. Then there are more monsters in the Umbral rather than the Axiom, because the longer you stay in the Umbral world, the more the creatures there are aware of you. So not only do you have the creatures of the Axiom world in the Umbral, you also have additional monsters from there too. Imagine you optimize this game for Axiom. You barely eked out 30 or 60 FPS most of the time in that world. So then you switch to the Umbral and you add new details, more particle effects, and multiple, often either like a half a dozen or more enemies at a time. What do you think is going to happen to the FPS? It could barely handle everything that was going on before. Now you add more stuff and even more enemies. You add enough enemies that they nearly entirely block your path at times, especially if you're trying to run past them because you can't fight that many people at once. The FPS tanks. That's one of the major problems with the technical side of Lords of the Fallen. Too much on screen at once, and the developers obviously didn't optimize it for console. Don't believe the patches or updates that they've released. This game still runs horribly on console as of September of 2024, nearly a year after release. I'm not one of those people who are going to turn off a game if it's 30 FPS when I want 60 FPS. But when it frequently goes below 20 or even 10 FPS for long stretches of time, that's too much for an action game. Then you die because one of the other of slew of design decisions that they made that I'm going to be talking about in the rest of the review forces you to redo these sections multiple times. So you're dealing with frame rate issues and then all these other things as well. My advice is skip this game on console. Don't bother installing it, even if you have Game Pass and it's free. It's not worth the time of installing.
Orius, forgive me, and steer this weapon of deliverance to a worthier servant than I.
Graphically, Lords of the Fallen looks fantastic. There are rare times when the FPS is good and the camera isn't getting in your way all the time. You'll be marveling at these environments. It's unfortunate that there wasn't more done with these graphics though. Cinematics are few and far between, and most of the dialogue is delivered to your character standing in front of an NPC and having them talk to you. I mean, that is typical for Souls-like, and it will remind you of, say, Elden Ring or any of the other From Software Souls games. In my opinion, the armor and the weapons are really standout. They're rendered in high detail and each are really interesting. Bloodstained or rusted, barbed and hooked, everything looks used and painful to touch. The environments are unique and well crafted. The water looks incredible. Everything in this game looks good. It's the most noticeable and memorable part of Lords of the Fallen. And when you hear people talk about it, you're going to hear about the graphics.
Lo, the latest receiver of his grace. Great potential dwells within you, doubtless, for you to be chosen thusly.
There isn't much going on in Lords of the Fallen story-wise. If you've never played the old game, don't worry about it. If there is a connection here, it's nearly non-existent outside of a few names that share between the games. I played the original Lords of the Fallen when it was released, and I can't remember a single thing about it. This new Lords of the Fallen, pretty much the same when I was done. The story is pretty threadbare. You get a lamp that lets you come back from the dead, there are other people who had this lamp in the past, and there's evil people trying to get it. There is this good god that isn't really that good, and a bad god that isn't that bad. The good god is the god of light, and they ruled this world for a long time, using a group of knights and sentinels that blocked Adir, the bad god, from entering the world. There are 5 portals or cleansing points that have been corrupted, allowing Adir and his people to enter this world. Your task is to cleanse these 5 portals and defeat Adir. That's the story in a nutshell. There's additional lore and item descriptions and some characters you meet along the way, but there's not a lot. Things are often confusing, with dialogue easily missed and NPCs forgotten. There's also a lot of lag in progression, where you're going to be moving on to the next story beat, and then the NPCs in the hub area are kind of guiding you there. They don't really acknowledge your progress that much. Overall, the story feels like they had a bunch of lore bits during development, and at some point somebody put them on a bunch of cards and pinned them to a board and said, okay, let's make a story out of this. And then development changed studios a couple times, and the cards either got lost or shuffled, and then only a few of them remained, and then they put together what they had and then cut the bits between. Originally, it seemed like this was going to be either a close sequel or maybe a reimagining of the first Lords of the Fallen, but that idea was changed somewhere along the way, and they only used a few of the common names of the gods and stuff in the world while throwing away most of the rest.
Give me that lamp.
Gameplay. It's a Souls-like, and it plays like a mix between Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne. But rather than that fast-paced action of, say, Elden Ring or Bloodborne, movement is much slower, being more like your character's speed has been reduced by half. Starting with combat, there are a variety of weapons to use, like hammers, swords, spears, etc. You can use them one-handed or two, or you can even dual-wield them to combine status effects. Weapons and armor can be found out in the wild as points of light, bought from vendors, or purchased from remembrances of bosses you defeated. The combat just didn't feel great to me. It lacks that tightness and finesse of the later Souls games. The feel of Souls-like combat can be hard to describe without having played it. How do you talk about input lag or action canceling and have somebody who's not really totally familiar with it understand it? A good term I've heard used to describe Lords of the Fallen combat is like your character is moving underwater. Everything is a half beat slower than what you would expect. You don't close with enemies as quickly as you would want. Your weapon or the enemy's weapon always seems to reach a little further than you thought it would, or maybe not far enough at times than what you would expect. There's something off about the iframes. Like, I would take hits that I clearly saw miss, or I would hit enemies that I didn't think I would hit. The rolls aren't as good as I like. The backstep didn't carry me as far as I wanted. The run is a bit too slow for boss battles that have them moving far away. The water slows you down by an incredible amount. To add to combat is a magic system, and you have 3 to choose from. Radiant magic, which is like holy magic or prayers from Dark Souls. Inferno, which is kind of like pyromancy, and the Umbral, which is like those curses or void magic thing that you can get from Dark Souls. Each uses a catalyst, and in the best part of Lords of the Fallen that I wish Elden Ring, 2 would incorporate, you can equip multiple spells at the same time. So you switch between them using one of your buttons. You just hold the left trigger to bring up the catalyst, and then press the button on the screen to equip the spell that you want, and then cast it with the right trigger. But there are some other problems with combat as well. Lords of the Fallen has an incredibly dense amount of enemies. This is even after patches reduced their spawn rates. There are times when you're in the Umbral or certain areas of the game that you're going to have dozens of enemies surrounding you, with more coming every second. It also loves ranged enemies, which is a problem when you match it with your slow character speed. Then you have a lot of enemies that stagger you with one hit, push you off ledges, which are numerous, or have unblockable attacks like grab attacks and stuff. There are a lot of combat parts of Lords of the Fallen that are the worst aspects of early Souls games. A lot of the enemy placement from Dark Souls 2, which people really harped on when that game came out, like suddenly ganging up on you or leaping down from above, that kind of thing. There's a lot of ledge combat from Dark Souls 1, with you falling to your death from ranged enemies or people shoving you off. It's all those things that From Software limited in their later releases and had only been there in the original for like artificial difficulty and like surprise factor that people kind of moved away from. Moving on from combat, we have the world design. The best way I can describe it in Dark Souls terms is like take the worst parts of Blighttown from Dark Souls 1 and make an entire game based on that. There's a lot of verticality to the levels, a lot of climbing up or climbing down to new areas. There's a ton of narrow hallways, small areas filled with enemies without a lot of room to maneuver. There are minimal shortcuts in this game and an obscene amount of narrow ledges. I mean, Lords of the Fallen is in love with narrow ledges and like planks and boards over gaps, to the point where falling is one of the major difficulties throughout the entire game. The levels lack that connectivity of the hub that Dark Souls possessed. They can be confusing at times, easily allowing you to become incredibly lost, and there's very few markers to tell you which way to go. You don't have a map to help you navigate. Instead, it's this journal page with a few crudely drawn pictures and arrows to show you where you're supposed to go, but no context really on how to get there or what those areas look like. I got lost and stuck so many times in Lords of the Fallen. It was a big where do I go now type of game, where you're going to find like a single ladder tucked away somewhere out of sight, and it's surrounded by like dozens of enemies that you ran past because you're out of health and you missed it, so you have to go back later. Finally, we have the bonfires or vestiges. There are a few fixed vestiges that allow you to teleport, heal, and upgrade your character, but they're pretty rare. Much more rare than, say, Elden Ring. These are on the level of, say, Demon Souls, where they're mostly in the beginning or the end of a map. Expect a vestige before a hard boss like Elden Ring would prepare you for? Nope, it's back to the beginning if you fail. Instead, you have these temporary vestiges called seedlings, and you plant them in the flower beds. They stay there until you make another one, allowing you to travel back and forth to the hub, but not permanently explore each area. It makes for like an interesting idea, but the problem is you don't get very many of these seedlings, so you kind of hoard them. It's a way to make you value them, pushing on to the level as much as possible before you want to use them, or before the boss arena before you run out. I say it's an interesting idea, but in execution it didn't work. The limited fixed vestiges makes exploring past areas difficult, since you're going to need to traverse large sections in search of items you missed or whatever you need, and you're going to need more vestige seedlings. The limited amount of seeds means you don't want to use them unless you have to, and you often die before you can. There's a lot of trying to run past hordes of enemies, and difficult sections of Lords of the Fallen in order to find, a rare vestige or flower bed to plant that seed. But when you combine this rush with poor performance and confusing level design, it does become very tedious. I often found it better to try and run to the end of the level, plant the seed before the boss, and then backtrack in search of items or to grind for XP and materials.
O holy Aureus, by your radiance grant me the strength to continue to endure these dark days, to lay bare the path to salvation for my wayward brothers and sisters.
As I said in other reviews of Soul games, difficulty is very subjective. What I find hard might be easy for you. Combat is a classic example of this. If you hate, say, precise timings and memorizing movements, then you're going to find certain bosses very hard. And for other people, they're going to just have it click and it's going to be super easy. In my experience, Lords of the Fallen isn't that traditional hard. It uses a lot of artificial difficulty to make it hard. They use ledges or unfair enemies or ranged enemies. There's boss designs that actively make it unfun, in my opinion, to play against them. Let's start with the bosses. Generally, I don't need the grind in Souls games when I play them. I've played a lot of them, and I beat them just fine by progressing in the natural route. Sure, sometimes I do get stuck, and I need to use, say, a spirit summon or multiplayer to carry me through, or other tools available. That's just part of the game, and it's just a different playstyle. But Lords of the Fallen was one of the first games where I just got stuck on every boss I played, and I had to grind for levels. There's one, the Hushed Saint, that I want to focus on. It's one of the first real bosses that you fight guarding a portal, and it involves two phases. The first, he rides a horse, and he hits you for heavy damage before jumping off and fighting you one-on-one. You could get a few hits in, and then he rides away. The second part has him leave that horse entirely and just fight you one-on-one. Now he's hard. He hits for a lot of damage, and he has a lot of health. You can summon NPCs to help fight, but they do die pretty quickly. But why I think this boss is, say, on fun is the fact that while he's on the horse, you can't hurt him. You can parry his attacks, knocking him off his horse, but that is incredibly risky, and you need good timing, otherwise you're going to get wrecked, because one hit from him can take like half of your health. You can, as another option, blow up these blue orbs in the umbral with your lamp, and that'll knock him off his horse, but again, you need really good timing, and the camera isn't great for letting you know where he is, because every time his horse disappears, you lose your lock-on. So the safest strategy, and the one that I use, is just to dodge and wait for him to jump off his horse. After he rides at you like 3 or 4 times, he does it over and over again, you have a short fight. It also makes the NPCs really useless that you can summon, because he's going to target them and strike them, and then before he even jumps off his horse, he's going to kill them. What I'm saying is, Lords of the Fallen is filled with poorly designed bosses. Going back to our whiteboard and cards analogy from the story, it's like a group of designers had these ideas on cards and pinned them on a board. But then when they went to make them, they either didn't know or didn't bother or didn't care if the fight was fun. They just had this idea of, okay, we'll put this boss on a horse, but never really thought about, well, how do we make that fun? Go back to your favorite boss in any of the From Software Dark Souls games. They're usually based off like a single strategy or a gimmick or something. While the bosses in Lords of the Fallen are often not either tuned correctly for what a player can do, or like they fly away too fast, or they move too quickly and you can't catch up to them. The best thing I can say about the bosses is that they often telegraph their attacks well in advance, allowing you to respond in time. But the player movement speed is punishing. It's almost like a lot of the fights are similar in spirit to the Elden Beast from Elden Ring, without Torrent to ride. Great leaps in distance that you can't close quickly and artificially drag out the fight.
Your flesh has been made sacrosanct with the mark of the Dark Crusaders. Prove yourself worthy of this gift. Seek me in the bowels of the bridge. Our work is of the greatest import.
Is Lords of the Fallen hard? No, not in a traditional sense. There are going to be a lot of people saying it's easy, that I just suck at it, I didn't build my character correctly, or a slew of other things, and those are all valid opinions. But Souls games need to be able to move past this get good mentality and I feel that From Software recognized that in Elden Ring. While Lords of the Fallen is relying on the community's willingness to forgive bad systems or designs of artificial difficulty as the player's fault. Yes, I absolutely agree. You need to get good at games. There's a skill requirement to most of them. But there are also things that developers do and people forgive that needs to be fixed as well. Thanks for listening to me rant a bit, and if you like the review, please leave a like or subscribe. If you've played Lords of the Fallen, let me know below what you thought of it. Did you play it on console, and how is the performance? If you're a PC player, is it better than on console? And what'd you think of it? I'm the Casual Console Gamer, and I'll see you all in the next review.